Hello guys and welcome back to the Wolf Digest. I'm your host Amaras.
And I am the co-host Terkanil. Today we are bringing you effectively a part 1 roundup of Computex 2019. I say part 1 because
so much stuff, right?
So we're going to start out with the parts that really we're the most excited about. And we're going to throw a couple other things in just to, round it out. But there is a lot of pieces we want to go over, and most of that focuses on Ryzen.
Of course.
The Ryzen 3000 series has been officially announced, and we have, well, we could say a full lineup, but current rumor has it that AMD is still holding back.
And holding back, they probably rightly should. I mean, if you can sell not necessarily what would have been your flagship, or flagship prices just due to the performance potential of it, and with Intel not really having anything to answer back with, why not, right?
And based on, there's been some talk, there's been some rumor out there that Intel may be pitching something in a couple of months down the line.
Well, it's not necessarily a rumor. We know based on their release cycle that their high-end desktop chips are due to land somewhere around August.
Yeah, it's just a question of if it's going to do much.
Well, we know that they're going to be based off of the previous gen, so it's not going to include Cascade Lake, so they're not going to be two Xeon CPUs glued together like their Cascade Lake EX, I believe is the ending on them. So we're not going to see some crazy 48-core desktop chip, most likely, but it doesn't exclude the fact that we'll probably see 28 core, maybe even a little bit more than that, but we'll see.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether they do decide to push out. I mean, 28 core is what we have currently at the higher end of the Intel.
Well, you remember the water-cooled benchmark that they ran, right?
No, not water-cooled.
Well, I know.
That's straight up AC.
Yeah, it's true.
Industrial
strength air conditioning will.
Yeah, and that thing is now out on the market. The motherboard is like $2,000. The chip's like $4,000.
And it takes more than that monthly to power. No, not really, but still,
Probably.
It feels like it.
But everything else, and then on top of that, in order to even that particular chip must be water cooled.
Yes. But that chip is a 28 core, if I remember correctly. So that's why I was saying 28 core is likely what we're going to see out of that lineup that lands sometime this fall. So
something we'll be looking forward to see what Intel can actually do.
Yeah, but as soon as they drop that, Threadripper 3 is most likely going to land in addition to the top end of the desktop platform, which will make the mid-grade high-end desktop look pretty benign.
So it's going to be a very, very interesting year. And we thought, 2 years ago was interesting.
With Ryzen landing, I think this release is probably one of the biggest upsets we've had. I wouldn't say it's more of an upset than Ryzen originally was, because holy cow, right? But
they had to do a panic response to that.
Well, yeah. But once again, instead of Ryzen doubling cores from 4 to 8, we now have a potential doubling of cores from 8 to 16 in similar price brackets. That's the key.
Considering that, that kind of jump just a couple of years ago from Intel was pushing upwards of $1,000 to $2,000 on consumer systems. I should know I have something that was a 6-core and cost me $1,000.
Yeah, exactly. And now you can get a 6-core for what, $130 off of Newegg, and then throw it on a $50 motherboard. I mean, it's pretty ludicrous, quite honestly. And the Ryzen 3000 stuff is just as ludicrous, but we'll get into that in a second. The first thing we wanted to mention, this will help anyone that has a Ryzen platform today. Like, you can go and download this. It's a Ryzen memory tweaking software They call it the DRAM calculator for Ryzen. It's on version 151 at the moment, and it has a built-in memory benchmark that you can use to check the stability of your overclock once you set it. But this is what you would do in lieu of setting your XMP settings for your RAM, because I don't know about you, but using XMP to try to get the RAM timings out of my RAM for my Ryzen platform just hasn't really been working too well for me. I was able to do it, but once I upgraded my BIOS to the AJASA 0072 in preparation for the Ryzen 3000 to come out, then my timings kind of reverted back a step or two, and so I'm probably going to have to use this myself to get my clock speeds back to where they should be. There's been some really good reports with this where you've been able to get up to 3466 or even 3800 off of your RAM on the current gen Ryzen. So definitely run over. We got a link down in the description for this, so be sure to go and download it, test for yourself. Just don't burn your RAM up. So keep your voltages in check, that kind of thing. And do know where your BIOS battery is. You might have to pop it once or twice.
Well, one thing at least, if you don't, at least kind of interesting, I saw coming out of Computex, just as a side note. We might try to find a link. No guarantees, but there was actually one of the vendors had a water cooling setup that not only water cooled the CPU, but also water cooled the RAM.
Well, hopefully
Kinda
we don't
strange,
get to the
but
point where the RAM has to be water cooled, but I don't.
it's something you're showing off. So
Yeah. I mean, if you're setting up a water cooled system and you want to keep all the heat out of the case, why not, right?
there's some. One thing I can say is, if you go out to YouTube and search for Computex and water cooling, there is a lot of new water cooling stuff coming out of Computex. Some of it went from crazy to holy boop. Um, I mean, even and a lot of it was prototype. As an example, you know who Der Bauer is, right?
Uh-huh.
So he had a prototype board he was working on. Was it Der Bauer? I think it was. And they had water cooling on the board, and the water cooling would also connect into other parts. So you just sort of slot it on. It was a very strange rig, but interesting video. But something, as I said, something to look up, for later.
Yep.
But I say we go and jump into our.
Let's get in the nitty gritty, shall we?
The fun stuff that we've been kind of drilling over for the last week.
So, as an aside, Adored TV actually launched a website that they're producing print articles now, so sure to check that out. I chose to use their article for the 3000 launch, mainly because they included pretty much all the slide deck slides in here in one quick distilled format. But we have the Ryzen 3000 series. They're claiming a 15% uplift, and obviously the 2x cache size, which we knew about from the first of the year, CES, when they launched the Epic Rome series. They talked about a little bit of the CPU die, and one of those things was that they doubled the cache size pretty much across the board. And so we knew that that would help with the IPC just on its own, not having to go back to RAM to fetch a lot of the stuff they could prefetch. And of course, the doubling of the floating point on the CPU as well. And so we could get some very strong floating point improvements, and that'll be a very interesting benchmark to keep an eye on when all the NDAs fall off. And by the way, that date is 7/7, as was rumored for a long time.
So July 7th is what we'll be looking at.
And it'll be the day you can buy them, too. They'll be on shelf at that point. So
don't be surprised if you hear us, talking about our pre-orders.
Yeah. Now, to break down the actual CPUs, we have the Ryzen 9 3900X. Do note that this lineup is slightly different than the rumored lineup that was out, probably because they decided not to release a 16-core chip just yet. And that's the thing, is the high end is a 12-core, 24-thread at 3.8 gigahertz base frequency, 4.6 gigahertz boost, which is actually a pretty nice uplift considering they did a node shrink and all of the talk about actually having performance regression with the node shrink, like Intel is talking between 14 nanometer and 10 nanometer. So we have the two chiplets you can see here in this picture, and you have 6 cores on one, 6 on the other. And it's kind of been my thought that they're saving their really good 8-core dies and for the Ryzen 7, because they don't want to waste 2 dies on a single chip for that, right? But also keeping some of them for servers, because that's really where the bread and butter is. They're going to make their most margin off the server CPUs. And then as they go down, you got Ryzen 7 3800X and 3700X. These are both 8-core chips. And you have the 3800X providing a 3.9 base frequency, which is 100 megahertz higher than the 3900X. This might actually end up being a pretty good gaming chip, but since these are all X series CPUs, they can all be overclocked anyway, so you'll probably get just as good overclocks out of some of these if you win the silicon lottery just a little bit, or you buy one of these slightly higher binned CPUs. But you got a 6-core and an 8-core on the table here. Both are running 3.8, 3.9. So you could probably get a pretty decent overclock out of that and have a pretty good gaming rig and not have to worry about a slight frames per second deficit. But we will have to see what the benchmarks prove out on 7.7. So maybe not pre-order your CPU, but certainly read the benchmarks day one and get your order in. The one thing we do know, or at least can guess at, since they had the little bit of delay due to the 500 series chipset problems that they were running into, they probably have enough stock of these CPUs you don't have to worry about them selling out.
That's usually been something that AMD has been really good at, is keeping stock up.
Yeah. And we'll also see the Ryzen 3 series come out a little later. But right now, the bottom end that they've announced is their 6-core, 12-thread at $200, 3.6 gigahertz base frequency. Hey, that's pretty nice.
Yeah, I think it's actually higher than my old 6800K that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So to give you all a point of reference there.
Well, we had to overclock that thing, and we were barely able to get it stable at what, 4?
4.2 is where we got it to.
Yeah. Then you have to back it down 100 megahertz because of some fringe issues.
That was when we tried to go to 4.3.
I see. Because we started at 4.4, that's why I was a little confused. We had to keep stepping it down because it kept
4.4
presenting
didn't work
instability.
4.4 was too unstable. 4.3 had issues. 4.2 was technically stable.
Yeah.
The system would still crash about every now and again.
Well, with gaming performance, AMD presented their own benchmark comparisons versus the 2700X, and you can see they have anywhere from 34% all the way down to 11% uplift on this smattering of games. A lot of these are things like LOL, Dota, Overwatch, these really fast-paced or low-demand games that would really tax the CPU rather than the GPU. That's kind of why I like this assortment of benches that they show here. These are games where they were having problems keeping up with the frame rates being offered by the Intel side of CPU market. And they're showing that they made a pretty strong comeback in these titles. So we
That's a very
also,
good thing to run or to have on the AMD front, since while AMD has always been the, if you want to save a little money, go AMD. You'll lose a little bit of performance. Now it's nice to say it'll be kind of interesting to see if it turns into you can save some money and go AMD and you're still going to get relatively similar performance.
yeah, you don't have to sacrifice your gaming frame rate just to have that high end performance in pretty much every other workload, right? Especially at the same price point. That's always been the thing that you've had to shy away from before is, oh, you're just going to be gaming. Well, maybe this low end four core, fourth, or 6 core, no threaded, so just 6 core, 6 thread CPU is what you want. Even though it's not what's best for you, it's going to be best for gaming, which is what you say you're going to be doing 99% of the time. And of course, a lot of the people we talk with are like, but I want to stream on the side, and I want to do this kind of thing, and I want to watch this or have 4 screens or any of these other things. And it's like, well, you're doing that. You're no longer just looking for a gaming CPU, and you'll probably want something more holistic. But you might not have to make that sacrifice anymore. And definitely, if you look at power consumption, if you're the type that likes to monitor their power usage and keep that under control, Ryzen is coming at more performance for lower power. And that's pretty much the really awesome thing about this lineup is you look at the TDPs, you got 12 cores at 105 watts, and you have 8 cores at 65 and 95 watt kind of setups here. You can get some pretty efficient chips, and note that these are the chips under load, unlike Intel, which rates their TDP based on idle power use, pretty much base clock, with no boosting counted in. And as soon as boosting happens, Intel's power consumption starts going through the roof. Where you got Ryzen, you look at the 2700X, for instance, it barely hits 110 watts at full tilt.
Yeah, so it really is gonna be an interesting year just to see what ends up actually playing out as the actual truths. Because while the benchmarks they show are definitely interesting to behold, it's gonna be always a case to see if that actually holds up, once people start getting their hands and start, putting everything to the test.
Yep.
And while we're definitely optimistic based on the performance of Ryzen so far, um, it's still a case of wait and find out.
Of course, it's always a wait and see kind of thing. One thing we do know as well is that they will be soldering their 3rd-gen Ryzen. As you can see, somebody asked on Twitter, will it be soldered? And they got a response back from AMD's senior technical marketing manager, said soldered like a boss. So we're assuming that's gold plating and all that good stuff. Basically the top end soldering that we've been seeing from their CPUs to date. And you can see here with the Threadripper picture, we can expect more of the same, which is a good thing for sure. But what are we going to put these CPUs in? They did have a smattering of X570 series motherboards being shown off all over Computex. We're actually going to run down a very long list of some of those motherboards.
And this list is the boards that have been shown off and ranged anywhere from the nice cheap end, literally, I think it's 1 or 2 that were sub 100, on up to the couple of $100 or $300-$400 of potential range.
So far, the cheapest I've seen for the X570 boards is about $170, and they go all the way up to $600.
I think I even heard of one. I think it was for AMD that could have been pushing 1,000, but I can't be certain on that one. I may be.
Oh, you're probably talking the Aqua.
There was one that was just
they only had
insane.
1,000 boards they manufactured, and they were selling them at $9.99 a piece or something like that. Craziness.
Something crazy.
They might be in the bottom of this list or something, but we'll see when we get there.
The boards have been showing off have all been very interesting, I will say, especially considering the fact that all of these have had upgrades made to chipset cooling.
Yes, except
All
for
of
one. the Aorus Extreme is the only one that I've seen so far that doesn't have active cooling on the chipset. And the chipset is rated at about 11 watts compared to 3 watts for the 400 series. So huge power draw increase from that, which necessitated the era of active cooling be brought back once again. But you can see here from this picture, they put a very large heat sink and a heat pipe that comes up to the VRMs just to dissipate the heat off of this chipset. And this is a $600 board, just in case you're wondering. But all the other boards all have fans and that active cooling there on the chipset. Out of all of them, I kind of like the steampunk thing going on with the Tai Chi, even though it's just a bunch of logos and decals pretty much. This right here behind the glass was kind of a nice touch. Active cooling, kind of hidden by a grill, so it's not too bad. Do see a lot of RGB for sure. Fortunately, there's a few that have kind of minimal RGB. It's not too bad. A lot of different designs, depending on what you're looking at for. So whether you have glass on the side of your case or not, still look like pretty nice motherboards. Some of the more compact boards, in case if you're looking for ITX, which is actually something that's kind of hard to find with the 400X series. So it's kind of nice that they're bringing that in. A lot of them have these shrouds, definitely for marketing, as you can see from the branding all over them. This one actually has kind of a pretty nifty layout there. I've seen a lot of this wireless built into the motherboard, which is kind of a nice thing. A lot of gamers are probably using wireless, even though probably shouldn't if you're totally worried about your frames and any kind of ping time variance. I do like the red tracing on this MSI board. In case if you're wondering, we're near the bottom of the article now, Kirk. But one thing I do want to mention that did come up is that the 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs, there is very selective and most likely not supported on these 500 series boards. So if you look across our thing here, we have our 1st gen AMD not supported on X570, and the APUs are not supported on X570. If you go up to 3rd gen, they may or may not be supported on the old 370, 350 motherboards, and definitely not on the A320 motherboards. And this is pretty much up to the manufacturer on whether they will support it or not. Just don't expect it. There has been some announcements from certain manufacturers that say they will be supporting some of the 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs. So definitely check with your manufacturer if you don't plan on upgrading your motherboard. I'm going to probably see if I can get away with not upgrading my motherboard, but these motherboards look really nice and I might end up upgrading anyway.
Yeah, at least in my case, what I'd probably end up planning to do at this point is upgrading for me means getting a new motherboard because I'm currently running an Intel.
Sucker!
And hey, it worked at the time.
Of course. You were forced to upgrade, what, 3 months before Ryzen landed?
4.
It was a sad day because you needed it, so it's not like it was a bad idea at the time.
And like as been stated before, we had absolutely no honest clue what Ryzen was actually going to do. We were
we didn't have anywhere
optimistic,
near the
but
leaks.
not. Yeah, we're kind of optimistic that Ryzen would do okay.
Yeah, we were just hoping for, 4-core 8-thread, maybe 6-core 12-thread, but with IPC that's kind of lagging behind Intel, so the 6-core would be the same as a 4-core kind of thing. But
we were not expecting it to come out, and
we were pleasantly surprised and had an order placed day one.
Well, at least you did.
Yeah, I did. I needed it. I was on an old Intel board too.
Yours is even older than mine. What I was upgrading from was 4 years older. So
yeah, well, I was running a delidded Ivy bridge that it was being overclocked to where it was starting to cry a little bit and wasn't providing me with the stability that I needed, obviously. But I was still able to double my performance. I could render these videos for YouTube and whatnot in half the time. No question.
Yeah, meanwhile, I was coming up from a Core i7-920 Gen 1.
Oh, yeah, those old Nehalem ones.
That actually, and what's kind of funny is random node. I actually decided to refurbish that thing, and it makes a good server.
Yeah, triple channel memory.
But looking forward as to what all available kind of things that we kind of expect, especially with, some of the options that are being pushed out, like with PCIe 4, since AMD is now pushing that quite heavily, and there was a fair amount of that at the show.
Yeah.
And now we, at least some motherboards that are, pre X570 are going to be able to utilize that. So it's going to be, even especially in that regard, a good year for AMD.
Well, that's actually what we wanted to talk about next. The PCIe 4 support that we currently see in the beta BIOSes for 300 and 400 series boards is going to be a beta only option. They're actually not going to officially support PCIe 4.0 on pre-X570 motherboards. And so when you get your final BIOSes, just due to wanting to maintain the stability and performance, they're not going to have official 4.0 support. It was a sad day when I heard that, but this is coming straight from Robert Halleck, Senior Technical Marketing Manager. So, it is true.
Yeah, they mentioned it would be available, so we'll see how much that actually ends up playing out.
Well, we all know how the unofficial overclocking for non-K series Intel CPUs went, right? I think it'll be good if they maintain a parity with the official BIOS, but then have a side BIOS, beta BIOS, where they just add back that 4.0 support again. Run it if you want, basically. But that just depends on your motherboard manufacturer. One thing we probably do want to note is Intel's response to this. Basically, the i9-9900KS.
I personally, did they announce a price? I don't remember hearing.
No, they did not. But what do you think a highly binned chip of a $490 CPU will cost?
At this point, I would expect them to, considering Intel, my guess, and I'm going to be generous here, but I'm going to be personally looking at 600 to 700.
No, it's an 8-core 16 thread. I mean, 600 to 700. I don't think that's going to be
the 9900K was at 500 at release. So, like I said, I may be being generous, But
I'm thinking it's going to land somewhere in the 570, 580 range. So $100 premium over their lower end chip. But I mean, they're guaranteeing an all core turbo of 5 gigahertz, which is pretty ridiculous, quite honestly.
and that's what the S means.
Yes, ridiculous.
Yeah, so we don't have any. Some of the information about this has been unfortunately lacking from what we've been able to find so far. But base frequency of 4.0 compared to the 3.6 of the regular 9900K, and an all-core turbo of 5 gigahertz. It still has the iGPU, same as the 9900K, but at this time there is no listed TDP, and I have not heard a price.
Well, one thing we can always look at is we have the silicon lottery, which is kind of a good indicator of quality, quantity, and the other. But we have a placeholder for the 9900KS. The thing we want to point out is for a 5.1 gigahertz boxed 9900K, that's $929 for a part that they guarantee will just hit 5.1, and that's not all core. That's going to be
Single.
Yeah, or dual core under boost conditions at this V core and all that. You're going to be seeing, oh yeah, here we go. 8% of the 9900Ks were able to hit 5.1 or greater. So very low quantity of these are going to be made for KS all core. I would say it's less than that 8%. And do note that this is also going to siphon out the better CPUs amongst the 9900Ks, because they're going to start selling those at a different price bracket. But 929, you got your 5 gigahertz at 579. This is why I'm thinking it's probably going to be 580 range, maybe even closer to 600 now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, definitely
I'd put it at 600 to 700, but that's me.
Well,
but the problem,
if Intel is Intel, that might happen, but I think that's too big of a price jump.
But part of it just comes down to what they're willing to get away with.
Can you imagine the power that that's going to draw?
Well, considering how much that overclocking one of those things to be able to do that by default.
Yeah, you see these CPUs hitting 200 watts just off of tuning and overclocking as it is.
Yeah, that one, running that sucker on air is
gonna not be possible. Yeah.
Well, it might be possible, but you're going to be looking at one of the more like a Noctua, or that level of cooler.
Mm.
So just this giant block of metal hanging off your CPU to pull it off.
Yeah,
or you're going to have to go liquid cooling.
And this CPU isn't even going to be available until Q4. So do note that as well. By then, we're probably going to see Threadripper 3, or at the very least, the 16-core Ryzen. And I just don't think Intel's going to have anything to really combat against this for quite some time. We've seen their roadmap. We've seen where they're at with their 10 nanometer. And even with their Ice Lake chips that they announced at Computex, those are only for ultra thin, ultra portables. Things like a Microsoft Surface. They're meant for low wattage usage. The top end that they listed was 25 watts.
Yeah.
And
very, very low power things.
And they top out at 4-core 8-thread with a iGPU that is beefy, but it's nothing to write home about, I don't think.
Yeah, right. And a lot of the roadmap for Intel for getting, hitting new, seriously hitting new on the desktop. I mean, actually new. We're not, so going beyond that 14 nanometer refresh of extra refreshes is late next year into 2021.
Yeah, we're talking February 2021 is when you can expect a decent response on the desktop. And that's quite sad, really. The only thing they can do is just keep kicking the can down the road. We might see some 10-core CPUs based off of the same architecture, but they're going to have to start trickling down some of their uh, Xeon class hardware, or they're going to have to adjust their pricing. I think that's really what it's going to come down to. But the problem is these chips, they just can't produce them in the numbers that they need to actually drop the price, or else they would have by now, right?
That's been the biggest problem over the last year and a half, is that Intel hasn't had enough chips being produced to keep on the market,
Yeah,
and
they
as a
got
result, the costs just continue to stay high, and a lot of people and companies have been switching to Ryzen simply because it's there.
yeah, it's cheaper, it's more power efficient. I mean, if nothing else, the power efficiency alone is enough to make a case. I mean, you look at Rome and what they demoed at CES. If you can get even 80-90% of the performance of an Intel chip, but at 2/3 the power draw, or even less, sometimes half the power draw, that's the bread and butter right there. You're going to be running that server for 3 years at practically full tilt in an air conditioned room. So the more power you produce, the more air conditioning you have to push. So not only do you power the chip, but you power the air conditioner that cools that chip. And they can make up thousands of dollars over the course of the lifetime of a server in their data center. And
You know, that's the
that,
money that they have to put forth to keeping that cool or keeping it powered. That's long term running, and that's more what companies are going to be looking at. Is not, you know, how much does this cost now, but how much is this going to cost me in the long.
yeah, and you're looking at things like Cascade Lake, where they're taking two of their 28 core chips or worse and gluing them together on a socket and then releasing that as a dual socket server. Those aren't going to be off the shelf servers. Those are going to be special servers with special cooling in order to run those. Those are 400 watts per socket. You're going to have to upgrade the data center's air conditioning just to handle that. There's a lot of logistics involved in that, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to go for that.
Well, you know, as we mentioned, with I mentioned earlier about the workstation chip, that was a 28 core part. The motherboard, there's a handful of motherboards for that chip
At
and
$2,000.
at that $2,000 mark, but they are all. It's essentially a slightly toned down, heavy server board,
Mm-hmm.
and these are insane to the extent that the board actually requires you to plug in two CPU power slots.
Yeah.
That's normally something you don't see except on a super high-end consumer overclocking board.
Yeah. And those CPUs are going to be $3,000 a piece anyway. The ones that are 56 core for these next gen Cascade Lake chips, they're going to be $10,000-$12,000 a piece. And if you can get even, like I said, 80% of that performance out of a chip that only costs you $6,000 or $5,000 and draws half the power or less, I mean, that's practically a no-brainer. The only person that would get that server would be the people that are highly dependent on real-time transaction processing and that need every last bit of performance that the tuned software can get out of those Intel chips. That's really the only case I can see.
The only other specific case there is, certain, like software are geared best on Intel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know several people that have gone to Intel just because, like I got this, but it works. I could try it on, an AMD system, but it's not going to work well for these reasons. But if I do it on Intel, which is what it was built on and built for, then it all works perfectly.
Yeah,
And
but
that's
even though it
one of
has
the cases.
even though it has a detriment on AMD hardware, if you're throwing more cores at it, it should make up the difference. Unless if it's software that isn't really well tuned to multi-core. If it doesn't scale well, or if it's just single core to begin with, like certain games or some software, like, yeah, I'm not going to name names, but still.
But that's something else that's also to note on the Ryzen 3000 is that one of the things that's being brought up is single core performance with Ryzen 3000.
Oh yeah, the IPC being uplifted on average 15%. That's going to definitely help. The thing I see as being a real benefit is going to be the doubling of the cache sizes. I mean, you already saw with that one test that you ran into on accident, the performance of Ryzen when doing 2 H.264 transcodes at the same time, which is something you don't see with any benchmark out there, is something being run concurrently with something else, right?
It's not considered a common use case, and so they don't think about it. But you actually can attest to that one.
I was laughing because you were telling me about this benchmark, and I looked down and I'm handbraking something while generating something in Premiere, and I'm like, I'm doing that right now.
So it's one of those cases of someone could say, well, it's not exactly a real world use case.
I was doing it at that moment, just out of the blue.
Yeah, so yeah, it is not. If someone says it's not, yes, it is a real world use case. Maybe not common.
I mean, what I would like to see is games being benchmarked while running like the capture software from the video card. Like the the Relive or whatever software from AMD, or the
Relive and Shadowplay.
The Shadowplay from NVIDIA, where you just do your keystroke and it saves the last 10 seconds of gameplay. Have that active while you're running the benches. I mean, that's probably not something everyone runs with, but it would be a good example of perhaps streaming or something like that, or just using the technology we have at hand rather than worrying about bleeding edge performance. What is our frame rate going to be if we're utilizing all these different social media features in the game that allow us to instant tweet out our last 10 seconds headshot or something like that? And that's really where Ryzen steps forward and has its bread and butter, is in those multitasking things that actually use all these 12 cores or 16 cores and things like that, rather than focusing on these games that are optimized for 4 cores and saying, look, I got an extra 10 or 20 FPS at 720p, I'm the superior CPU. No, you're not. And that's what a lot of people miss.
Yeah, they keep focusing on, a lot of people focus it on, here's my shooter, and that's where they stop. But
yeah,
a lot of us, while we play shooters on occasion, we are usually doing other things. And like, in what our case is here is, we'll be playing, for example, World of Warcraft. And then we'll have a lot of stuff. And I mean, quite a bit going in the background. Like in your case, you'll have, Handbrake or something running while you're playing WoW and you're in a raid.
Yeah.
Which means there's a lot of stuff going on screen.
I can raid in WoW while handbraking a video while streaming with my 3D generated wolf head that you see here. Doing all this stuff, and I'm only on the 8 core. So imagine what I could do with a 12, right? That's my reason to upgrade. Betterment and benefit to you guys. I can kick videos out faster. I can still play games and stuff if you guys want game reviews or gameplay footage, whatever you want. I can kick it out for you if you just ask. Use the comments. But I can get all this stuff out faster and definitely run stuff through the video editing software faster.
And that's the kind of thing we are definitely interested in, is what, how much more can we do while being able to just stack it on top of other things.
Yeah.
And
I mean, there's always been the elephant in the room of, why don't you just get a separate system that you do this stuff on rather than using your production system or something like that. And
cost.
Yeah, it comes down to cost, but also management. I mean, I'd like to produce this stuff on the system that has my multiple screens. I'd have to get multiple screens for that system, and then I'd have to kind of have it next to my main system. That adds more noise to the studio. Yeah, it starts to become a logistics nightmare, really. Having all of that built into the one system that's doing what I'm doing here makes it so much easier, and the turnaround faster on this stuff. But I think we should call it for time. I think we've talked your ear off on that topic enough. I hope it was interesting for you to actually have some of that real world use case as opposed to just giving you news. And that's kind of what we're here about on the Wolf Digest. So if you like that, do hit the like and subscribe. Check back with us. We're going to kick out another video here in a bit about Navi, actually. So stay tuned for that, and we will catch you later.
Have a good one.